EDU-ARCTIC 2, Polar Research for Education, innovative program in Poland and Norway. Webinars.
So today we're going to talk about Arctic soils. They are quite specific, but we will have to start with what soils really are, what they actually are, what are their properties, and how these Arctic soils are different or similar, what are their properties, and as usual, what is the relation between this part of the geosystem and climate, and also maybe climate change. So let's start with what is soil. And quite often we do not appreciate enough soil because it seems so obvious. It's always there, at least in most ecosystems, because it's a foundation of all terrestrial ecosystems, or maybe almost all terrestrial ecosystems, I would say. And like I said, because they're always under our feet, they can be easily overlooked and not appreciated enough. Well, they play a crucial role in many processes. And actually, soil is a combination of elements of different spheres, like atmosphere, which are gases that also form a part of soils, also pedosphere and hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere. Biosphere, by that I mean plants, animals, and also other living organisms like microbes, and also the byproducts which contribute to forming, shaping, and changing soils. And about soil composition, it is often said that soil is a sort of a recipe, but recipe, like a cuisine recipe, that consists of 5 ingredients, 5 basic ingredients, which are minerals, organic matter, living organisms, thus biosphere, gas, and water. So it's a mixture, sort of a mixture, and the recipe is different in different soils, but in general, the minerals are approximately 45%, and the organic matter is about 5%. Actually, the empty space is quite large because it's approximately 50%, and this empty space without minerals or organic matter is filled with air and water mostly. And to begin with, we'll focus on soil minerals. And soil minerals are divided, or can be divided into 3 classes based on their size. And these classes are shown to you with a laser pointer, are clay, which is the smallest size class, silt, and sand, which is the largest. And the percentage of particles in this size classes is called soil texture. So the soil texture depends on whether we have more sand size class or silt or clay size class in those minerals, of course. Then about soil organic matter. These are plant, animal, and microbial residues, and they're decomposed or decomposing, so they're in various states of decomposition, and it's a very critical ingredient. And the percentage of soil organic matter is among the best indicators of soil quality, especially in terms of agricultural use of soils. So the more organic matter we have, the better soil we have to use to grow food, for example. And as for living organisms, which are present in soil, they include very different organisms, starting with archaea, bacteria, fungi, algae, and protozoa, but also a wide variety of larger soil fauna like mites, nematodes, also earthworms, which are really, really important, and larger organisms like rodents, which are burrowing rodents, for example, moths. So they can vary from very, very tiny to quite big. So soil gases are the gases that are found in the airspace between soil components, and the primary soil gases are nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. So it's more or less like in the atmosphere, but of course the content of particular gases is different than in the atmosphere, and also it varies between soils, and the oxygen actually is critical because it allows respiration of both plant roots and soil organisms. So other natural soil gases that can be found in soil are like methane or radon, just to mention two most popular. And so these are the gases, and of course there's also water, which is with the air, it's filling approximately 50% of this mixture. What we see here is a so-called soil profile. Of course, it's like a perfect or like a model profile, and it's definitely not the same for every type of soil and for every time of the year or for every location on Earth. It's pretty different, but it's just like a model soil profile. And because each soil has its own set of characteristics. And so when we dig down deep into any soil, we'll see that it's made of layers. And those layers are so-called horizons. And those horizons are most commonly marked with letters. So we have letter O, letter A, B, C, so E, R. So when we put those horizons together, they form a soil profile. And its soil profile is sort of a biography of the of particular soil. And most soils have three major horizons, which is A, B, and C. And some also have this organic horizon. So starting with this organic horizon, it's so-called humus. It's mostly organic matter, like decomposing leaves, for example. Sometimes it's not present at all, sometimes it's quite thick, sometimes it's quite thin. Then we have a so-called A horizon, which is topsoil. And topsoil is mostly consists of minerals from parent material, also with some organic matter incorporated. So it's usually quite dark. So this is a good material for plants and other organisms to live. Then there is this horizon named B, which is subsoil, rather rich in minerals that either they usually leached, like moved down from the A zone, from the A horizon, and accumulated here. And C is so-called parent material, and this is the deposit at Earth's surface, and basically this is the deposit from which the soil developed. So why do soils look different in different places? I mentioned that this is like a model profile, but they can be very different. They can have different horizons. Some are more significant, some are more visible, and some are less visible. Sometimes it's quite difficult to determine where a horizon ends and where another starts. It's not always that easy in actual field work. Actually, it's really, really hard to determine the layers in real life. So soil formation the question was, why do soils look different in different places? So soil formation is a process that requires an action, but it's not human action. Also, human action can also play a role, but it's an action of climate, of organisms, of relief, of parent material, and time. So you have climate, C, organisms, O, relief, that is more or less topography, R, parent material, and time. So the abbreviation of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Factors is so-called CLORPT. CLORPT means the key to what the soil looks like. So without these factors, without CLORPT, there would be absolutely no soil. So let's start with parent material. So the weathering takes place where some environmental processes occur, like rainfall, freezing, thawing. All these processes act on rocks, causing them to dissolve, to fracture, to break into pieces. So in the beginning, we had a solid rock, bedrock, and it started to change because of some processes caused by climate, for example, and so on. So the rocks and other base materials from which soil develops are referred to as parent materials. And for example, they may have been transported from one place and deposited in another place, for example, by glaciers, or by wind, or by water, or by gravity. So then the temperature and precipitation, which is mostly climate, influence the rate at which the parent material weathers, so at which it changes. So for example, climate may influence the rate at which the dead plants and animals decompose. It's either faster, like in the tropics, or slower, like in the Arctic. And this can further affect the chemical, physical, biological relationships in the soil. So then we have organisms like plants and animals, which also influence the formation and also the differentiation of those soil horizons, soil layers. And together with microorganisms that live in soil, they speed up the breakdown of large soil particles into smaller ones. So the relief is, in other words, a landform. We would say a landscape. And so this position, which describes the shape of land, like whether we have hills or we have valleys, and also the direction. For example, the hill faces. So it all makes a difference whether it faces north or south. If it's warmer all day, or if it's colder and wetter, and so on. So all this, also the exposure of soil, can affect the way it looks like. So relief here is also described as topography. So these are those five factors, because the fifth factor is actually time. It all takes time to start with, to begin with the parent material, to start breaking down, and the formation of all that. So that's basically it. The difference between humid warm and dry climate, starting with the same basic material. So this is this climate factor affecting what the soil looks like. Here we have an example of topography. This R factor, which means that exposure can also affect the way that soil is formed. We have organisms like earthworms, which can speed up the processes of decomposing, for example, because they play a large role. They bring larger pieces of leaves or other organic material, dead organic matter, deeper into the soil, and also they cut them down to smaller pieces, which accelerates the process of decomposing. So like I said, the time is a fifth factor. So here you can see the whole process, starting with no soil at all, only parent material, and at the end we have so-called old soil. We have more and more horizons, more and more layers, and this is how it changes. We have less rock and more soil layers. I started with saying that we owe a lot. We do not always appreciate soils the way we should, and this is the moment when I tell you what we actually owe them, or at least a part of it. So soils play a vital role in the Earth's ecosystems. So without soil, our human life would be very, very difficult. And it provides plants with a place to hold their roots. It holds the necessary nutrients for plants to grow. Also, those plants are not only plants that provide oxygen in our atmosphere, but also our crops, our food. Also, the rainwater is filtered through soil, and soil also may regulate the discharge of excess rainwater, preventing such catastrophic events like flooding. It is also capable, soil is also capable of storing large amounts of organic carbon. It also is sort of a buffer against pollution, against pollutants. So it's protecting groundwater, and a lot of people are very dependent on groundwater quality, because sometimes it's the only source of drinking water. From our human perspective, it provides us also with some essential construction and manufacturing materials. We build our houses with bricks, and bricks are made from clay, so clay is part of soil. We drink coffee from a cup that is essentially baked soil, which is also clay. And we also find records of past environmental conditions in soil. So the soil functions and all the things that we owe to soil are general capabilities that are important for various uses like food, biomass production, some environmental interactions, habitat for many organisms, source of some materials like raw materials, I mentioned clay, and also sort of a platform for humanity. It would be very difficult to create anything without soil. So we have buildings, we have highways, and it's all under and underneath there's soil. And also, not many people know that most antibiotics were taken from soil microorganisms. So soils also help us to maintain our health. So this is what happens in soil, and the basic processes are additions, transformations, and losses. So additions of materials come with rain, because water percolates through soil, and also from parent material. Some minerals are added to soil from the parent material, so these are the additions. Also some losses, because when water percolates, it also makes the soil lose some of its values. But there are also processes like erosion or leaching that I mentioned, that losing some value, like nutrients, for example. But also there are some transformations or translocations. Some particles move down within the profile. These are translocations. And transformations mean that some minerals may change. So they can change into another mineral. So this whole bunch of processes occurs in soil. One of the most important processes is so-called nutrient cycle, and those nutrients that are here, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and sulfur. They are the most important nutrients in the cycle, and this is where we are getting closer and closer to the Arctic component of today's webinar. So soil in general stores and moderates the release of nutrients and other elements, but also is a theater of cycles of nutrients. So there are various biochemical processes which are quite analogous to the water cycle that we know, and carbon cycle also. So nutrients circulate in the system. They can be held in the soil, lost to air, lost to water. Well, they're not really lost because it's just lost by soil, but they're still in the system. And in general, from the perspective of living organisms, it is important that the nutrients are transformed into forms that are available for plants. And about this availability, which is also very important from the Arctic perspective, here's something I would like you to see. So this is a graphic representation of an existing law, environmental law, you might say, which is called Liebig's law or minimum law of the minimum. So it is a principle, basically, which is, thanks to this graphic representation, is quite easy to understand. So the general idea is that those parts of this vessel represent different elements, and this time it applies to nutrients, but it does not have to only apply to nutrients. It may apply to different factors. But in general, the thing is these are different types of elements. And what we can see here, that the element that is most lacking, we might say, or there's the least of it, is like the determining factor, which decides that, well, the fluid will spill out, no matter how high are other elements, no matter how much zincum or manganium we have. It's still the elements that are most lacking, which are the most important ones. So this is the condition of balance. So it can be, this law can be applied to biological populations, ecosystem models, to many different things, many limiting factors. Because in soils, especially in Arctic soils, there are two nutrients which are the most limiting factors, which are nitrogen and phosphorus, two of them. Out of these four that are crucial in general for living organisms. And these two are usually lacking, especially in the Arctic. So no matter how much other we have, these two are the limiting factor of any biological production, primary production, for example. So about Arctic soils. We speak about Arctic soil, but there many different types. They vary in their composition. So this percentage of slate clay and sand. Some have permanent snow cover, some do not. They also have different water content, and the type and the intensity of vegetation, the content of organic matter, and so on and so on. Also, the permafrost, the presence of permafrost, or the extent of permafrost, is one of the very important factors that influences what the Arctic soil looks like. In general, the common factor are low temperatures, and this is very common factor and very important, and also very limiting in terms of the processes that occur in Arctic soil. So what are they like? First of all, the fact that there is permafrost and there is also ice in permafrost causes a series of some very complicated, complex processes. So there are processes that create stress and pressure, and the result is deformation and rearrangement of those layers, of those soil horizons. And in some cases, also translocation of elements, such as some materials. So this leads to some properties that are very unique, both on macro and micro levels. Some very specific thermal characteristics, and physical and chemical properties. So those, we should not expect those very model-like horizons, model-like layers. What we do expect, and we do encounter very often, is a process called cryoturbation, which means that horizons are very disturbed, they're mixed, they're not like very distinguished, but their surface is very disturbed. Also, due to low temperature, due to low amount of microbes, and also due to the fact that there are no earthworms in the Arctic, the decomposition process is very, very slow. So the cycle of the nutrients is also quite slow, which means that on one hand, we could say that they're very poor, nutrient-poor soils. On the other hand, they're very rich in, for example, in organic carbon. We could say that there is a sort of sink of organic carbon, because it does not decompose so fast, as in other latitudes. So this is why this is sort of a sink of organic carbon. It simply does not decompose. There's usually quite little liquid water, and because, like I said, the nutrients cycling is very slow, it's poor in nutrients, especially these two, nitrogen and phosphorus. So N and P are very limiting factors. But it's not the case everywhere. It's not the case everywhere that they are completely poor in nutrients. And poor ecosystems are generally nutrient poor, but some organic matter is added to the soil, but not by people who try to fertilize it, but we would say naturally, thanks to populations, especially populations of seabirds. In the Arctic, we owe these natural fertilizers mostly to little oaks, these birds, and the fertilizer comes in the form of guano, also eggshells, dead bird remains, feathers, and all that matter brought in the large amount leads to the formation of ornithogenic soils. Actually, in another polar ecosystem, in the Antarctic, these soils can also cure and do occur around or in active or maybe sometimes abandoned penguin colonies. So in the north it's little oaks, and in the south it's penguins that create these naturally intensely fertilized grounds. So the large accumulation of organic matter of this marine origin, because both penguins and both the little oaks, they bring this matter from the sea, because they feed in the sea, but they come back to land, they form colonies there. So this accumulation of marine originating organic matter is around breeding colonies, and it contributes to emergence of vast areas of tundra, ornithogenic tundra. And this tundra is characterized by very rich plant communities. So there are some areas which are fertilized by birds, also around Polish polar station Hornsund, Spitsbergen, and it's very easy to distinct, because they're very, very green areas. They become green, of course, after the colonies are formed, but they are normally the tundra is rather gray, brown, gray, a little bit of green, but these patches of ground, of soil, are very, very green. So birds not only change conditions because they bring a lot of nutrients, but they also bring microorganisms in their guano, for example. So they sort of inoculate microorganisms with guano deposition. So the composition of their diet can influence the composition of microorganisms. And we know that the more microorganisms we have, the more intense the composition we can expect. So, of course, it's still limited by temperature, but this is what these ornithogenic soils look like and work like. These are the effects of perturbation that I mentioned. It's very common, this mixing of materials from various horizons. So as you can see, it's really, really difficult to tell the difference between horizons and to identify them. And this happened due to freezing and thawing, continuous freezing and thawing. So these horizons became like this, disturbed. As this process occurs, so the upper soil material gradually dries out, and there is quite a lot of organic matter, especially carbon, which is transported downwards, so deeper into the soil, and it also has some consequences, especially for the climate change, because as usual, climate change also poses some questions about the future of Arctic soils, what we can expect with changing climate. So if we know that low temperatures are one of the factors that are limiting the composition processes, so and limits vegetation, we can expect that there will be longer vegetation cycles because there will be more nutrients available. The composition of organic matter will be faster, so their availability will increase. Also, we can expect that this sink of carbon will no longer work as a storage, but it will release the carbon dioxide and methane instead, which is bad news, especially for climate change and for potential positive feedback loop. So the more the temperature will cause the Arctic soils to release more carbon, the more the climate change will intensify. So that's why it is a positive feedback loop. New species might arrive with higher temperature, longer vegetation cycles, plants, but also earthworms possibly. But also this has some other consequences. So if we have longer vegetation cycles, so the surface will be probably darker with less snow and more tundra cover. So the albedo will probably get lower, which means that less energy will be reflected back to the universe. So more energy will be absorbed. And again, we will have this positive feedback loop. But there is also some good news, or it is considered a possible counteraction or natural counteraction. With cryoturbation, we might actually trap more carbon inside. Like I said, the carbon will be probably, or is probably brought, translocated deeper into the soil, so it's not released then. So the more cryoturbation we have, then we'll have more trapping of carbon in soil. So in this case, we could talk about a negative feedback loop. So the effect would act against the cause in such case. So that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Watch other recordings from webinars on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/EDU-ARCTIC. EDU-ARCTIC 2. From polar research to scientific passion, innovative nature education in Poland and Norway receives a grant of 240,000 euros received from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway under EEA funds.